I've learned that every great financial gamble starts with good intentions. They never call it greed or panic or politics. They call it stimulus. A policy born, they say, to protect prosperity. It always begins in an atmosphere of relief. Markets breathe easier. Commentators talk about decisive leadership. The headlines celebrate trillion-dollar packages and record low taxes as if we've discovered perpetual motion. But behind the applause, the arithmetic stays the same. You can't cut revenue, raise spending, and promise stability forever. That equation only balances on paper. The latest number, $600 billion, looked simple enough. A mix of rate reductions, corporate incentives, and emergency credits. Politically, it sold itself. Growth without sacrifice, prosperity without pain. But what it really was underneath the speeches and press releases was an attempt to purchase time, because every administration eventually runs out of time. Debt piles up, wages stall, and voters start to notice the strain. So the system reaches for its oldest trick, borrow from tomorrow to pay for today. When I look back across decades of fiscal policy, I see the same curve repeating. Lower taxes, higher deficits, rising promises. At first, the engine hums smoothly. Investment surges, profits climb, optimism blooms. But what few acknowledge is the cost hidden beneath that optimism, the erosion of discipline. Tax cuts sound virtuous because they put money back into people's hands. But when they arrive without spending restraint, they don't free the economy, they feed its addiction. They tell consumers and corporations alike that debt is normal, that leverage equals strength, that the bill will never come due. I remember the first time I realized how fragile that assumption was. It wasn't during a crisis, it was during a boom. Everyone felt invincible. Interest rates were low, credit was endless, and policymakers insisted the good times would last. That's always when the fracture begins. Not when people are afraid, but when they've stopped being afraid. Now we stand in another version of that same story. $600 billion. A number large enough to dazzle, yet small enough to rationalize. This will pay for itself, they said. It'll spark growth, they said. But growth built on subtraction isn't growth. It's depletion. You can almost feel the weight shifting beneath the surface. Each dollar borrowed pushes the structure a little further out of balance. And while the architects celebrate their creation, the foundation, quiet, unseen, starts to strain. I'm not angry about it anymore, just fascinated by how predictable it is. Every generation discovers debt as if it's a new invention, forgets its consequences, and then remembers them all at once. History doesn't repeat, it rehearses. And right now, the rehearsal is reaching its final act. $600 billion. That's not an investment in the future. It's a bet against it. And the stakes are rising. You can feel it long before the headlines catch on. That subtle rise in heat across the system. The numbers still look stable. The charts still glow green, but the rhythm has changed. Every bubble has its heartbeat. At first it sounds like growth, then it becomes acceleration, and before you know it, it's panic. A pulse racing faster than it can sustain. $600 billion. It doesn't sound dangerous when you say it quickly. It sounds technical, managed, maybe even necessary. But when that kind of money floods through an economy already saturated with cheap credit, it doesn't soothe the pressure. It multiplies it. That's the paradox no one wants to face. Stimulus is addictive. The more you use it, the less it works. Like morphine for a patient who refuses to heal, each dose buys a little time, a little confidence, a little applause. But under the applause, the dependency deepens. You can see it in the markets. The way investors stop watching fundamentals and start watching each other, the way corporations take on record debt, not because they need it, but because they can. The way households treat credit like income and banks pretend that risk is obsolete, and all of it, every transaction, every digit on every balance sheet, is backed by one shared illusion that interest rates will stay low, that inflation will stay tame, that faith in the system will hold just long enough for the next cycle to begin. But when you feed that illusion $600 billion of borrowed fuel, you don't strengthen it. You light it on fire. Prices rise, not in explosions, but in whispers. Groceries edge up. Energy costs creep higher. Rent stretches further. Each increase seems harmless in isolation. Together they form a slow suffocation, and still the policymakers insist it's temporary. They always do. Transitory. That word becomes a lullaby sung over a nation that doesn't realize it's falling asleep in a burning room. Inflation isn't measured just in prices, it's measured in confidence. Once people stop believing in the stability of their own money, it doesn't matter how many charts you show them. They start hoarding, they start speculating, they start protecting themselves, and that collective self-protection turns faith into friction. I've seen this movie played before. In the 70s, it was oil. In 2008, it was mortgages. Now it's policy itself, a belief that politics can outwit economics. It never can, because the laws of finance aren't partisan. They don't care who signs the bill or who gives the speech. They only care about balance, input versus output, creation versus destruction, value versus illusion. And when that balance breaks, the correction comes like gravity reclaiming a stone thrown too high. You can already hear the excuses being written in advance. They'll say no one could have predicted it. They'll say global shocks, foreign conflicts, unforeseen events. They'll say anything except the truth, that this fire was lit deliberately because the pain of restraint was politically unbearable. That's what inflation really is. The price of avoiding smaller pain earlier, each rate cut delayed, each deficit ignored, each new program justified by temporary necessity becomes another match dropped on a dry field, and soon the blaze doesn't need help to spread. It feeds on itself. Markets begin to wobble. Investors quietly withdraw. Foreign creditors start to hedge, and through it all, the ordinary citizen is told to stay calm, to believe that someone somewhere knows what they're doing, but they don't. Not anymore, because once the fire starts, no one controls it. They only manage the smoke. This is how systems burn. Not with explosions, but with slow, invisible heat that builds until everything familiar starts to melt. $600 billion. That's what it took to push the system from stability to strain, from relief to reckoning, and now the countdown begins. Every collapse begins quietly. You never hear the first crack. You feel it. A missed payment here. A failed auction there, a chart that dips just enough to unsettle the confident and confirm the cautious. At first they call it volatility, then they call it adjustment, then they stop calling it anything at all. $600 billion. That was the opening move, the spark. The rest was momentum. The markets had been living on caffeine and faith. Low rates kept everyone numb. Liquidity kept everyone talking. But the moment inflation began to speak louder than the policymakers, the spell broke. Interest costs climbed faster than revenues. The deficit widened like a fracture under stress. Corporations that borrowed cheap found themselves refinancing at double the rate. Households watched savings melt while credit lines stretched thin. And still, the promises kept coming. Temporary pressures, necessary adjustments, short-term volatility. Those phrases are the lullabies of every failing system. I've heard them in every crisis of my lifetime. They don't mean reassurance, they mean denial. Behind the scenes, the numbers were screaming the bond market, the quiet judge of every nation's credibility, began to lose faith. Yields spiked. Demand for long-term debt evaporated. Investors demanded a premium not for risk, but for belief. And when the bond market doubts you, you don't negotiate. You kneel. That's the moment governments rediscover humility. Not because they want to, but because arithmetic has no mercy. You could see the panic ripple through the institutions that once felt untouchable. Central banks that swore rates would stay low now scrambled to raise them. Legislators who once boasted about tax relief now whispered about spending cuts. Everyone looked for someone to blame. But the blame wasn't hidden. It was embedded in the design, in decades of policy built on convenience instead of courage. The public felt it last, as they always do. Groceries turned from budget line to luxury. Rents doubled in neighborhoods that hadn't changed in years, and wages, no matter how hard they ran, could never catch the prices ahead of them. That's how faith dies, not with riots, but with receipts. The middle class that had once been the backbone of stability became the engine of discontent. They didn't need economists to explain inflation. They could taste it. And once the population starts to feel the betrayal personally, policy loses its disguise. It was no longer about left or right, progress or conservatism. It was about survival. Economic gravity pulling everyone down to the same level of frustration. Meanwhile, the system tried to save face. Emergency meetings, special committees, joint statements crafted to sound like control. But control is an illusion once trust leaves the room. I remember watching a press conference once, years ago, during another crisis. The official on stage said, "The fundamentals remain strong." And I thought to myself, that's what people say right before they break. Because fundamentals don't fail in numbers first, they fail in confidence. When people stop believing the rules apply, the rules stop working. That's what this unraveling really is. The moment belief and behavior part ways, investors protect themselves. Politicians protect narratives. Citizens protect whatever value they can still reach, and between those three layers, the idea of unity dissolves. The $600 billion plan was meant to build strength. Instead, it revealed weakness. It showed how fragile prosperity becomes when it's built on deferred costs. The cracks are no longer invisible now. They're in the open. Interest bills rising faster than infrastructure, deficits swallowing entire budgets, inflation embedding itself into expectation. This is the unraveling, not a crash, not yet. Just a slow, grinding realization that the future has already been spent. And what happens next will decide whether the system bends or breaks. Because once confidence evaporates, recovery isn't about policy anymore. It's about belief. And belief is the hardest currency to earn back once it's gone. There comes a point in every cycle when the numbers stop mattering, when the graphs, the forecasts, the models, all the tools we built to measure certainty start to look like relics from another age, because the real crisis is no longer numerical, it's psychological. Confidence is a delicate thing. Once broken, it doesn't return on command. You can print money, you can raise rates, you can hold hearings, but you can't legislate belief, and belief, that shared conviction that tomorrow will roughly resemble today, is what keeps every system alive. That's what's evaporating now. For decades, we've lived on an unspoken assumption that the bill would always be deferred, that growth would always outrun debt, that the dollar would always hold its weight. But assumptions have limits, and we've reached them. $600 billion, a spark that promised revival, has become a mirror reflecting everything the system chose not to fix. You can feel it in the tone of the news. The words have changed. No one talks about stimulus anymore. They talk about stabilization. No one says temporary. They say managed. Language bends when reality intrudes. The truth is simple, but no one dares to say it. We've spent the future to preserve the present. And the interest on that bargain is now due. History always settles its accounts, sometimes with crashes, sometimes with quiet decay, sometimes with a single collective shrug, a population deciding that the promises mean nothing anymore. When I look back at every reckoning I've lived through, they all share one common feature. People thought they were smarter than the system that sustained them. They thought they could control debt, that they could manage inflation, that the rules of cause and effect could be rewritten with enough political will. But economics doesn't bow to slogans. It just waits. And when the waiting ends, the return to balance is brutal. You can see it now in the eyes of people who once believed in the machine, the analysts hedging their optimism, the executives cutting quietly, the citizens learning once again that the safety net was woven from credit, not strength. Yet even in this reckoning, there's something honest. Because collapse in its own way strips away illusion. It reminds us what was real all along: work, trust, discipline, and the idea that value must be earned, not declared. That's the hidden mercy of every financial fire. It clears the ground. It burns away the stories we told ourselves about endless expansion and painless prosperity. And from that ash, the next cycle begins. Maybe that's the lesson we keep refusing to learn, that no system is invincible, no currency eternal, and no society immune from the math it chooses to ignore. $600 billion. It was never just a number. It was a symbol of how far we were willing to go to avoid discomfort, and how quickly comfort can vanish when the bill arrives. The reckoning isn't dramatic, it's patient. It's a slow realization spreading through boardrooms and kitchen tables alike that we can't print trust, we can't legislate balance, and we can't keep borrowing faith from a future that no longer believes us. When the dust finally settles, we'll call it a correction, a transition, a necessary realignment. But deep down, we'll know what it really was. A reminder that the laws of value never stopped working. We simply stopped respecting them. And maybe, if we're lucky, this time we'll remember that lesson long enough to build something worth believing in again. Because money, at its core, is just trust. And trust is the one thing you can't bail out.